It was the phone call that ended my life, or so he thought. I was sitting at my desk, buried in tax files, when my husband Daniel's number flashed on the screen. There was no hello, no warmth, just a voice dripping with ice and arrogance. I just inherited $800 million. Pack your things and get out of my house. You're done. He didn't just want a divorce, he wanted to erase me. He wanted me gone before the money hit his account, so he wouldn't have to share a single cent of his new empire. He sent a security team to my office to confiscate my car keys in front of my coworkers. He thought he was humiliated me. He thought he was discarding a useless wife. But when I got home to the empty house and saw the divorce papers waiting on the dining table, I didn't scream. I didn't tear them up. I picked up a pen, and for the first time in years, I smiled. I signed my name with a steady hand. Daniel thought he had just won the lottery, but he made a fatal miscalculation. He forgot that for 12 years, I wasn't just his wife, I was the one who handled the paperwork. And he had no idea that the inheritance he was bragging about came with a secret condition, one that required my signature to unlock. He thought he was kicking me out. He didn't realize he was handing me the keys to his destruction. Keep watching, because what happens next isn't just revenge, it's a masterclass in justice. You won't believe who ends up on their knees. My name is Alicia Vance, a 46-year-old senior tax consultant who has spent the last 2 decades untangling the complex financial webs of the ultra-wealthy. I built my career and my life on the principles of precision, discretion, and absolute loyalty, believing that a marriage was a partnership that required the same rigorous honesty as a balanced ledger. I was about to learn, in the most public and humiliating way possible, that my husband Daniel viewed our 12 years together, not as a partnership, but as a transaction he was finally ready to close. The betrayal didn't happen in the privacy of our living room, it happened under the fluorescent lights of my firm, in the middle of the busiest week of tax season. The hum of the office died down instantly when 2 large men in dark, ill-fitting suits marched past the receptionist and stopped directly at my desk. They weren't police, and they certainly weren't clients. They were private security contractors. My colleagues, people I had mentored and shared coffee with for years, froze, their eyes darting between me and the intruders. The lead guard dropped a cheap cardboard box onto my meticulous paperwork, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Mr. Sterling has authorized the immediate recovery of all company assets," the guard announced, his voice booming with unnecessary aggression. "That includes the keys to the Mercedes, the corporate credit cards, and the cell phone. Hand them over, ma'am." My face burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. This was theater. Daniel wanted an audience. As I silently placed my car keys into the guard's open palm, the landline on my desk rang. I knew who it was before I picked it up. "Did you get my message?" Daniel's voice wasn't apologetic. It was euphoric, vibrating with a manic energy I hadn't heard in years. "Uncle Arthur is dead, Alicia. It's done. $800 million. It's all mine." I stared at the wall, gripping the receiver. "Is this necessary, Daniel? The security guards?" "I'm clearing the deck," he sneered, the cruelty in his voice sharp and deliberate. "I'm starting a new life. A life that fits my tax bracket. You don't fit anymore. Pack your personal trash and get out of my house." The locks change at midnight. The line went dead before I could speak, leaving me holding the phone while 20 pairs of eyes watched the company assets being marched out the door. I took a taxi home, a final indignity, and walked into the silence of the house I had managed, cleaned, and paid for during Daniel's numerous failed business ventures. He wasn't there to face me. He was a coward who preferred to strike from a distance. Instead, the divorce papers were waiting in the center of the dining table, weighing down a stack of unpaid bills he had ignored for months. I sat down and read them with the cold, analytical eye of a forensic accountant. It was a quickie divorce settlement, drafted with haste. He was offering me absolutely nothing except total freedom from his current debts. The strategy was transparent. In our state, inheritance is separate property, but if commingled with marital funds, it becomes divisible. Daniel was terrified that if he didn't sever the legal tie before the $800 million hit his account, I would be entitled to half. He was rushing to cut me loose to protect a fortune he didn't even have yet. I didn't cry. Tears are for people who have lost something valuable, and I realized in that moment that I wasn't losing a husband. I was losing a liability. I picked up his pen and signed the papers with a terrifying calmness. I left the document right where he would find it, whispering to the empty room. I hope you read the fine print of your new life as carefully as I read these papers. As I packed my modest suitcases, carefully folding the clothes I had bought with my own salary, I knew exactly what Daniel was doing across town. I knew the probate laws of this state better than he did. An estate of that magnitude takes a minimum of 30 days to clear federal banking regulations and anti-money laundering checks. The money wasn't in his account yet. But Daniel, blinded by greed and arrogance, wouldn't wait. He was out there right now, celebrating a victory he hadn't secured. I knew he was visiting high-risk lenders, taking out massive bridge loans with predatory interest rates, using the inheritance notification letter as collateral. He was likely signing a lease on a penthouse, putting a down payment on a yacht, and buying a diamond ring for the mistress he thought he had kept hidden. He was spending millions he didn't physically possess, building a skyscraper on a foundation of quicksand. Daniel thought he had signed me out of his future, but he had no idea that by rushing the divorce, he had just walked blindly into a trap set years ago by a dead man. The first night in my new apartment, the silence was absolute, a stark and welcome contrast to the chaos Daniel had unleashed upon my life. I had rented a one-bedroom unit on the quiet side of town, a place that smelled of lemon polish and fresh paint, rather than the stale pretension of the mansion I had just left. My life shrank down to the essentials: a capsule wardrobe, a single set of dishes, and my laptop. While I spent my evenings organizing my forensic accounting files and drinking tea from a mug that cost $3, Daniel was busy turning his life into a garish spectacle for the entire city to witness. I didn't have to look for news of him; it was unavoidable. The local gossip columns and social media feeds were saturated with grainy photos of him hosting lavish pre-celebration parties at exclusive clubs, surrounded by hangers-on who smelled the blood in the water. He was driving a brand-new Ferrari he couldn't possibly have paid for in cash yet, and on his arm was a woman young enough to be his daughter, wearing a diamond that caught the light with an almost vulgar intensity. He was living loud, fueled by the intoxicating promise of a wire transfer that was still weeks away, racking up debt with the confidence of a man who believes he is untouchable. I went back to work with my head held high, ignoring the pitying glances from the receptionist and the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered the break room. I found comfort in the immutable laws of mathematics and tax codes. Numbers didn't lie, numbers didn't cheat, and numbers certainly didn't discard you after 12 years of loyalty. It was precisely 2 weeks after I had signed the divorce papers, on a Tuesday evening rainstorm that battered the windows of my small sanctuary, when a knock came at the door. A soaked courier stood there, holding a thick, waterproof envelope stamped with the wax seal of Sterling, Holloway and Associates, Uncle Arthur's prestigious law firm. My heart hammered against my ribs as I signed for it, the weight of the package feeling substantial in my hands. I sat at my small kitchen table, using a steak knife to slice open the heavy linen paper, half expecting another legal threat from Daniel, or perhaps a final insult from his lawyers. Instead, a smaller, cream-colored envelope slid out, bearing my name in handwriting that was shaky but unmistakably familiar. It was a letter from Uncle Arthur, written just days before he passed. "Dear Alicia," it began, the ink slightly smudged as if he had paused to gather his strength. "If you are reading this, then Daniel has likely already shown his true colors. He is my nephew by blood, but he is a fool by nature. I watched you for 12 years, Alicia. I saw who balanced the books, who kept the peace, and who actually had the spine to run the family. I am leaving the money to him because the law compels me to care for kin, but I am not handing a loaded gun to a child. I am leaving the money to him, but I am leaving the brakes to you." My breath caught in my throat as I read the words again, tears finally pricking at the corners of my eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming vindication of being seen, truly seen, by the one man in that family who mattered. Beneath the letter was a sleek, black USB drive and a printed document titled "The Sterling Family Trust, Governing Articles." I opened my laptop with trembling fingers and plugged in the drive. A secure portal launched, demanding a biometric scan which, to my shock, accepted my fingerprint via the trackpad data Arthur must have collected years ago when I helped him update his estate planning, a Trojan horse I hadn't even recognized at the time. The screen flooded with data, displaying the staggering balance of $800 million sitting in a holding account. But it was the governance tab that made the room spin. There, in black and white, was my name listed not as a beneficiary, but as the guardian trustee, an irrevocable appointment made 5 years prior. I pulled the physical document closer to verify what I was seeing on the screen. The clause was ironclad. Any withdrawal exceeding $10,000 requires the dual signature of the beneficiary and the guardian trustee. I sat back, the air leaving my lungs in a rush. It went deeper. The document outlined my fiduciary duty, a legal obligation that gave me the absolute authority to veto any expenditure I deemed wasteful, immoral, or detrimental to the longevity of the trust. I wasn't just a signatory, I was the gatekeeper. I looked at the date on the screen. The funds were scheduled to vest and become accessible in exactly 14 days. Daniel believed that on that day, the bank vault would swing wide open for him. He had no idea that the vault had a second lock, and I was the only one holding the key. A dark, cold realization settled over me. I could call him right now. I could warn him to stop spending, to stop digging a hole with high-interest bridge loans that required a balloon payment he couldn't make without my approval. But I thought of the way he had sneered at me on the phone. The way he had stripped me of my car, my dignity, and my home. I closed the laptop slowly. I wouldn't tell him. I would let him spend every single day of the next 2 weeks buying things he couldn't afford, cementing his financial ruin. Daniel was busy popping champagne on a yacht he couldn't afford, unaware that the woman he just discarded was the only person in the world with the code to the vault. The final 24 hours before the scheduled transfer felt less like the passing of time and more like the slow, hissing burn of a fuse attached to a stick of dynamite. I spent that last day in my small apartment, surrounded not by party guests, but by the glowing screens of my monitors, tracking the digital footprint of my ex-husband's self-destruction. While I sat in silence, Daniel was busy orchestrating his grand finale, a grotesque event he had actually titled the Freedom Party. He had rented a sprawling estate on the cliffs overlooking the ocean, a property that cost $50,000 for a single night money he had borrowed at predatory rates just days prior. Through the social media feed of a former friend who couldn't resist documenting the spectacle, I watched the live stream of my own erasure. The estate was crowded with people who had never known Daniel when we were struggling to pay our mortgage, sycophants drawn to the smell of sudden wealth, like moths to a bug zapper. At the center of it all was Daniel, holding a magnum of champagne, his face flushed with alcohol and triumph. And clinging to his arm, draped in a silver dress that looked more like liquid than fabric, was Jessica. She was 25 years old, a yoga instructor he had met at the gym 3 weeks ago, now being introduced to the cheering crowd as the future Mrs. Sterling. I watched, unmoved, as Daniel raised his glass for a toast that made my stomach turn. "To upgrading," he shouted, his words slurring slightly as he gestured to the yacht anchored offshore and then to the woman beside him. "And to my ex-wife, Alicia, who is probably at home right now clipping coupons and wondering how to pay her electric bill. Here's to leaving the dead weight behind." The crowd roared with laughter, a sound that should have hurt, but instead, it only solidified my resolve. He wasn't just celebrating his new life, he was spitting on the 12 years I had spent building the foundation he was standing on. But beneath the glitz and the noise, a much darker reality was festering, one that only I could see from my vantage point as a forensic accountant. While Daniel was playing the billionaire playboy, his phone was vibrating incessantly in his pocket, a detail the cameras missed but the data confirmed. I was monitoring the public filings and UCC liens, and the picture they painted was catastrophic. The high-risk lenders he had courted men who didn't operate through traditional banks and certainly didn't forgive late payments were getting impatient. I could see the inquiries pinging his credit report every hour. He had borrowed against the inheritance letter not once, but 3 times, stacking leverage on top of leverage to fund the ring, the rental, and the yacht deposit. The hole he had dug was now $5 million deep. If the money didn't flow the moment the bank opened the next morning, he wouldn't just be broke, he would be destroyed. These creditors wouldn't just send angry letters, they would come for blood. Despite his cruelty, a lingering fragment of my professional ethics compelled me to offer him one final, slender lifeline. It was a test, perhaps, to see if there was any shred of the man I once loved left inside that tuxedo. I composed a formal email to Daniel and his lawyer, a man named Mr. Henderson, who was already mentally spending his commission check. I kept the subject line dry and urgent: compliance notice regarding Sterling Trust. The body of the email was brief and deliberately cryptic, designed to trigger a pause if they had any sense of caution. I strongly advise you to review Section 4, Paragraph C of the Trust Agreement regarding moral conduct and fiduciary oversight before attempting any transactions tomorrow. The terms are stricter than you anticipate. It was a warning shot, a chance for them to ask a question, to hesitate, to realize that $800 million rarely comes without strings. I waited. 10 minutes later, the reply came. Not from the lawyer, but from Daniel himself. It was a screenshot of my email, with a clown emoji pasted over it, followed by a text message that read, "Nice try, Alicia. Stop being jealous. My lawyer says you're just trying to scare me because you're bitter. I'm blocking this number. Don't call me when I'm rich." I stared at the screen, the final door closing between us. He had chosen his path. He had laughed in the face of the only person trying to save him from annihilation. I closed my laptop and turned off the lights, sleeping more soundly than I had in weeks. The sun rose on the day of the transfer with a blinding clarity, and across town, Daniel put on his best suit, smoothed his hair, and walked into the bank feeling like a king, never suspecting he was actually walking to the gallows. The First National Bank of the city was a fortress of polished marble and hushed conversations, a place where money wasn't just currency but a religion, and on the morning of the transfer, Daniel walked into it as if he were the high priest. I arrived 15 minutes later, entering through a private side entrance reserved for high-net-worth administrators, escorted by the bank's senior compliance officer. I wasn't wearing the worn-out cardigan and sensible slacks Daniel was used to seeing me in. Instead, I wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than my first car, a remnant of my life before I shrank myself to fit into his. I carried a leather portfolio, not a purse, and as I waited in the anteroom adjacent to the VIP suite, I could hear the muffled sounds of celebration leaking through the mahogany doors. Corks were popping. Glasses were clinking. Daniel's voice boomed above it all, bragging to the room about the penthouse he was going to buy that afternoon, blissfully unaware that the pen he was holding was about to run out of ink. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere was thick with greed and premature victory. Daniel sat at the center of the long table, Jessica perched on the arm of his chair like a trophy he had already purchased. His entourage, a mix of sycophants, his spineless lawyer Mr. Henderson, and a few high-end real estate agents hoping to close a deal surrounded him. The bank manager, Miss Thorne, a man with the weary expression of someone who had seen too many fortunes lost to stupidity, cleared his throat to get the room's attention. The laughter died down, replaced by an expectant silence. Daniel leaned back, spreading his arms wide. "Well, where's the check, Thorne? Or do I just swipe my card?" Mr. Thorne didn't smile. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the tablet in front of him. "Mr. Sterling, the funds are indeed in the holding account. However, as per the irrevocable terms of your late uncle's trust, the final release requires dual biometric authorization." Daniel frowned, confused. "Biometric? You mean a fingerprint?" "Fine. Bring the scanner." Mr. Thorne shook his head slowly. "Not just yours, sir. The trust stipulates that the funds can only be unlocked with the concurrent thumbprint of the guardian trustee." "The guardian, who?" Daniel laughed, looking at his lawyer. "What is he talking about?" Uncle Arthur didn't have a guardian. It was then that Miss Thorne pressed a button on the intercom and nodded toward the side door. "The guardian trustee is here now." The heavy mahogany doors swung open silently. I stepped into the room. The effect was immediate and absolute. The air seemed to leave the space. Daniel's smile froze, then curdled into a look of utter bewilderment. Jessica looked me up and down, confused by the presence of this sharp, formidable woman who looked nothing like the dowdy ex-wife Daniel had described. I didn't say a word. I walked past the stunned lawyers and the gaping real estate agents, the click of my heels on the marble floor the only sound in the room. I took the empty leather chair at the head of the table, the seat of authority, and placed my portfolio down with a deliberate heavy thud. "What is she doing here?" Daniel finally sputtered, standing up, his face flushing a dangerous shade of red. "This is a private meeting. Get her out of here." Mr. Henderson, his lawyer, was flipping frantically through the trust documents I had emailed him the night before the email he had ignored. His face went pale. "Daniel," Henderson whispered, his voice trembling. "Sit down. She's the trustee. It's in the bylaws. She controls the signature." Daniel looked from the lawyer to me, his eyes bulging. You? You control my money?" "It's not your money, Daniel," I said, my voice calm, projecting the cool authority of a judge delivering a verdict. "It's the Sterling Family Trust. And currently, you are merely a conditional beneficiary." Daniel slammed his hand on the table. "I don't care what you call it. Sign the damn release. I have people waiting to be paid. I have a deposit on the yacht due at noon." He pointed a shaking finger at the scanner. "Put your thumb on that machine, Alicia. Now." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not a husband, but a desperate, drowning child. I opened my portfolio. I didn't take out a pen. I took out a file folder labeled Due Diligence and spread 5 high-resolution photographs across the polished table. They were screenshots from his freedom party the night before, showing him dousing the crowd in champagne, and more importantly, copies of the lien notifications from the predatory lenders he had borrowed from. "As guardian trustee," I began, reciting the clause from memory, "I am bound by fiduciary duty to preserve the principle of the trust against waste, fraud, and mismanagement." I pointed to the photo of the yacht. "A $5 million boat is a depreciating asset." I pointed to the loan documents. "Borrowing at 40% interest is financial incompetence." I looked him dead in the eye. "And publicly slandering the trustee while funding a lifestyle you cannot afford falls under the moral conduct clause. Therefore, I am exercising my right to veto." I pushed the scanner away from me. "Request denied." "You can't do that!" Daniel screamed, lunging forward before his lawyer held him back. "I owe them money! They'll kill me!" "Then perhaps you shouldn't have spent money you didn't have," I replied, closing the folder. "The trust will not be used to clean up your mess." At that exact moment, the vibration of phones began to buzz against the table like a swarm of angry hornets. One by one, the real estate agents checked their screens, saw the transfer rejections, and quietly packed their bags, slipping out of the room. Mr. Henderson looked at his phone, saw his retainer hadn't cleared, and closed his briefcase. But the most chilling sound was Daniel's own phone. It began to ring with a harsh, demanding tone, the specific ringtone he had set for the loan shark. He stared at it in horror, the blood draining from his face as the reality of his position crashed down on him. He wasn't a millionaire. He was destitute. And he was cornered. He turned to Jessica, his eyes pleading for some kind of support, some reassurance that she was still with him even without the millions. Jessica looked at the frozen bank account on the screen, seeing the access denied in bold red letters. Then she looked at the vibrating phone, signaling dangerous debts. She looked at Daniel, sweating and terrified, and then she slowly, deliberately, uncurled her fingers from his arm and let go of his hand. The collapse of Daniel's empire didn't take weeks. It took exactly 48 hours for the facade of his new life to crumble into dust. After the disaster in the bank conference room, the wolves didn't just circle the house, they kicked down the door. The high-risk lenders he had borrowed from were not the type to send polite overdue notices or file civil lawsuits. They were men who operated in the shadows, enforcing their contracts with threats that left bruises. I stayed in my quiet apartment, watching the inevitable implosion from a distance, my phone silent while his likely rang off the hook with terrors I could only imagine. It wasn't until 2 o'clock in the morning on the second night that the final surrender arrived. There was a frantic, desperate pounding on my door, a sound so stripped of dignity that I knew instantly who was on the other side. When I opened the door, the man standing in the hallway bore little resemblance to the arrogant playboy who had sipped champagne 48 hours earlier. Daniel was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with dark circles, his designer suit rumpled and stained with sweat. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days because he was too afraid to close his eyes. He didn't storm in, he collapsed. He fell to his knees on my cheap entryway rug, gripping the hem of my bathrobe like a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood. He was weeping, harsh, racking sobs that shook his entire frame. "They're going to kill me, Alicia," he choked out, his voice thick with panic. 2 men followed me to the hotel. They said if I don't have the interest payment by Friday, they'll break my legs. Please. I don't want to go to prison. I don't want to die. I looked down at him, searching for any flicker of the husband I had once adored, but all I saw was a stranger who had gambled his soul and lost. There was no triumph in seeing him this low, only a cold, clinical satisfaction that the scales of the universe were finally balancing. I stepped back, forcing him to release my robe, and walked into the kitchen to put on the kettle. "Get up, Daniel," I said, my voice steady. "You're ruining the rug." He scrambled to his feet, following me like a beaten dog, wiping his nose on his sleeve. He sat at my small kitchen table, the same table where I had read Uncle Arthur's letter, and waited for me to speak, his hands trembling violently. "I will not give you $5 million to flush down the toilet," I began, pouring 2 cups of tea. "However, as the guardian trustee, I have an obligation to protect the Sterling family name from the scandal of a homicide or a prison sentence. Uncle Arthur wouldn't want his legacy stained by your incompetence." Daniel nodded frantically, hope sparking in his eyes. "So, you'll sign? You'll release the funds? I will pay the debts directly to the creditors," I corrected him, sliding a legal pad across the table. "But in exchange, you are going to agree to a restructuring of your lifestyle. You are insolvent, Daniel, and insolvent beneficiaries do not live in penthouses." I laid out the terms of his surrender, and with every sentence, I watched a piece of him wither away. The conditions were absolute. He was to surrender the lease on the luxury apartment immediately. The Ferrari he had put a deposit on was gone. The designer watches, the custom suits, the club memberships, all of it was to be liquidated to reimburse the trust for the interest payments. But the final blow was the living arrangement. I had already located a studio apartment for him in a drab, industrial part of the city, a place with thin walls and a view of a brick alleyway. "You will move in there tomorrow," I stated, pushing the pen toward him, "and you will receive a weekly stipend of $500 for food and essentials. All other expenses must be submitted to me for approval in triplicate. If you deviate from this budget by 1 cent, I cut you off completely." He stared at the paper, his mouth opening and closing in disbelief. $500? Alicia, that's... I can't live on that, that's poverty. "That's reality," I replied, taking a sip of my tea. "You wanted to be a rich man without the work. Now you're a child on an allowance. Sign it, or face the men waiting outside your hotel." He signed. He signed away his autonomy, his pride, and his freedom, trading them for safety under my supervision. He effectively became my dependent, a ward of the wife he had tried to discard. The final indignity came the next morning, as he sat in his new, cramped apartment, surrounded by cardboard boxes. He was waiting for his phone to ping, hoping for a message from Jessica, the future Mrs. Sterling, who had sworn her undying love just days before. When the message finally came, it wasn't a comfort. It was an eviction notice from his fantasy life. "I heard about the allowance," the text read, brutal in its brevity. "I don't date projects. Good luck with your ex-wife." That was it. No goodbye, no tears, just the cold calculation of a woman who realized the ATM was broken. Daniel sat alone on a second-hand mattress I had approved for purchase, staring at the wall. He had wanted to be the king of the world, free from my boring influence. Instead, his greed had turned time backward, reducing him to a sulking teenager waiting for his mother to deposit his pocket money. He had lost everything, but in the silence of that studio apartment, a dangerous resentment began to curdle in his gut. Daniel thought he could wait Alicia out, that eventually she would tire of the game, so he decided to try one last, desperate act of betrayal to steal back the control. For 6 agonizing months, I lived the life of a glorified prison warden, shackled to the very man I had tried to escape. Managing Daniel's existence under the allowance arrangement wasn't the victory I had imagined. It was a slow, grinding exhaustion of the soul. Every Tuesday, I had to review his pitiful receipts for groceries and subway fare, auditing his life to ensure he wasn't slipping money to loan sharks or buying contraband luxury items. I was still his wife in every way that mattered: his bookkeeper, his mother, his conscience, and he was still the heavy anchor dragging behind my ship, preventing me from sailing into open waters. I thought I had him controlled, but resentment is a powerful fuel. and Daniel had been burning it quietly in his cramped studio apartment, waiting for a lapse in my vigilance. The betrayal didn't come with a bang, but with a clumsy, desperate scratch of a pen that landed on my desk on a rainy Tuesday morning. I was reviewing the monthly bank statements for the trust when I saw a digital transfer request for $50,000, ostensibly for emergency medical expenses, authorized by a signature that looked remarkably like mine, but with a slight tremor at the peak of the A that I never made. He had tried to forge my consent. It was a sloppy, amateurish attempt to bypass the protocols, a criminal act born of pure entitlement and stupidity. He hadn't learned humility, he had only learned to hide his greed better. As I stared at the forgery, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. As long as I held the leash, I was just as tied to him as he was to me. I wasn't his jailer, I was his fellow inmate, serving a life sentence of supervising a grown man who refused to grow up. If I wanted my life back, my real life, I didn't need to control him. I needed to cut the cord entirely. I didn't call him to scream. I didn't summon him to my office for a lecture. Instead, I called Mr. Thorne at the bank and initiated the nuclear option, a dormant provision in Uncle Arthur's trust, known as the dissolution clause. 3 days later, we stood in the hushed, oak-paneled courtroom of the probate district. Daniel arrived looking hopeful, perhaps thinking I was finally tired of the game and was there to increase his stipend. He wore a cheap suit that didn't fit, his eyes darting nervously between me and the judge. He had no idea that I wasn't there to loosen the knot, I was there to burn the rope. Your Honor, I addressed the court, my voice ringing clear and steady. As guardian trustee, I present evidence Exhibit A, a fraudulent transfer attempt made by the beneficiary. I handed the forged document to the bailiff. Daniel stiffened, his face draining of color. Under Article 9, Section D of the Sterling Trust, I continued, if the beneficiary proves himself incorrigibly unfit through acts of fraud or criminal intent, the trustee is empowered to invoke immediate dissolution. The judge, a stern woman who had seen enough family squabbles to know a tragedy when she saw one, reviewed the evidence over her spectacles. And what is your recommendation for the disposition of the assets, Miss Vance? Daniel leaped to his feet. Disposition? What is she talking about? That's my money. You can't take it. Sit down, Mr. Sterling, the judge snapped. I turned to look at him one last time. There was no anger in my heart anymore, only a profound sense of release. It was never your money, Daniel. It was a test. And you failed. I turned back to the judge. Your Honor, in accordance with the charitable remainder provisions, I move to liquidate the entire asset base $795 million and distribute it equally among the street, Mary's Home for Orphans, the City Women's Shelter Network, and the National Foundation for Financial Literacy. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sharp intake of Daniel's breath. He looked as if he had been shot. No, he whispered, the sound scraping out of his throat. No, you can't. That's $800 million. You're throwing it away. I'm putting it where it will do good, I replied calmly. I'm giving it to people who will appreciate the value of $1, something you never learned. The gavel came down with a sound like a thunderclap. Motion granted. The trust is dissolved. In that single second, the fortune evaporated from his grasp forever. He wasn't just broke. He was erased. The legacy he thought was his birthright was gone, scattered to the winds to feed the hungry and shelter the abused. I signed the final transfer orders right there on the clerk's desk, my hand steady, my signature bold and authentic. Daniel slumped in his chair, a hollow shell of a man, watching the zeros vanish from his future. He had nothing left, no money, no wife, no status, and no future. I placed the pen down and walked toward the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. I didn't look back. I didn't need to see his face to know he was broken. I pushed open the doors and stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun. The air tasted sweeter, sharper. I walked past the news vans that were just arriving, ignoring their questions about the historic donation. I walked to the parking lot and unlocked my car, a sensible 4-year-old sedan that I had bought with my own salary, maintained with my own hands, and fueled with my own labor. I sat in the driver's seat and gripped the wheel. feeling a rush of euphoria that no amount of money could ever buy. I was not a billionaire. I would go back to work tomorrow. I would clip coupons and pay my bills and live a quiet life. But as I turned the key and the engine hummed to life, I felt lighter than air. I had finally severed the last link to a toxic man who had tried to bury me. He spent his life thinking money was power, but as he watched her drive away, he realized the truth too late. The ultimate power isn't controlling a fortune, it's having the strength to walk away from one. Alicia's decision to walk away from nearly $1 billion is one of the most controversial yet powerful choices a woman could make, proving that peace of mind is truly priceless and that dignity cannot be bought. Now I want to turn this question over to you because I know you have strong opinions on justice and family. If you held the keys to that vault, would you have donated the fortune to charity to teach a final lesson? Or would you have kept the money for yourself and simply left Daniel behind in the dust? Please share your honest thoughts in the comments section below, because I read every single one and I am truly curious to know what you would have done in her shoes. If this story of betrayal and ultimate redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, please take a moment to click that subscribe button right now, so you never miss a new episode. We are dedicated to bringing you the most gripping and emotional stories every single day, and we would be honored to have you join our growing community of listeners who believe in justice.